Alright, hello fellow YouTubers. So today, instead of doing a usual videos I do about tech, I'm going to do one about an event called the BookTubeAthon, basically just a online social media reading challenge. But before I go any further, I just got to say, send your thoughts and prayers to Sydney, formerly of the Tower Inn. Her family's going through some hardship, so just want to let her know that, we're still with her. So, for this year's Tubeathon, I chose to read, I've always used this as an excuse to try to get more into some classics, and I chose to read the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle because he only has 4 books and yet they left such an impact. Overall, the books I read during this BookTubeathon are Study in Scarlet, Sign of the Four, Hound of the Baskervilles, Valley of Fear, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the Lee Iacocca autobiography. I don't know what the Chinese one is, but it's famous sort of philosophical manual, Riders of the Purple Sage, and How the Devil Got His Cat. So the first of the many challenges put forth in the BookTubeathon is to let a coin toss decide the first book you read. And I did that with a study in Scarlet. I basically wrote the Sherlock Holmes books down on a piece of paper and just threw a coin at it. And oddly enough, it landed on the very first one ever released. These books are super short, so you can get through them really fast. Also, too, one of the challenges was read a book about something you want to do. I think we all wanted to solve a murder. So the coin toss, something you want to do, solved all the problems right there. After that, I read A Sign of the Four, also Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. And then I read The Hound of the Baskervilles and also saw the movie adaptation, which is the third challenge. So see a book and then look at its movie adaptation. Here again, like I said, Hound of the Baskervilles, like all of his Sherlock Holmes books, super quick, really fast reads, but nevertheless very good. And it was interesting to see how much of our actual picture of Sherlock Holmes doesn't come from the real Sherlock Holmes, or I'm sorry, not the real Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, instead is actually influenced by Basil Rathbone, a UK actor. And of course, the final one was Valley of Fear. And it was interesting, though, because I didn't know that there was a connection between Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's work and the work of somebody else on this list. We're going to get to that next. I read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This is a super quick read, but very good. It's a classic, and this one also satisfied the challenge of reading a book that has a beautiful spine. There are 2 companies that I think get spine art really good, and that is Signet Classic, and that would be Harper's Perennial Classics or Harper's Platinum Editions. Have very good spine art on them. This book I actually started before this week and have been nibbling at, but I finally got all of it finished up this week. And this is the biography of Lee Iacocca, who was a major mover and shaker in the automotive industry in Michigan in the 70s and 80s, a former president of Ford Motor Company. He then actually chose to move over to Chrysler and essentially made Chrysler into a phoenix, really got them out of the ashes. A lot of interesting stuff. The book's fascinating because when Lee Iacocca started his education that would take him to working in the automotive industry, America didn't have that many paved roads or that many cars. Like I said, this was a quick read. I got this book for free. And what I did essentially is it has 83 chapters. Each chapter is a paragraph on philosophy. I guess you could describe it as a type of art of war. And Zane Grey, Riders of the Purple Sage. This is another book I got off of Ann Arbor Downtown District Library's free cart. Usually the free cart has junk, but one day I came in there, they had a lot of westerns. This is a really great book. If you like action and you like bang 'em, shoot 'em up stuff, this is the book for you. I see why this book is so highly reviewed. It is a quick, nice read. I don't want to get too much into anything that could be considered spoilers, although let's face it, this book's been out for a while now. But one of the things that's very interesting is the first book I chose to read was A Study in Scarlet, which gets into the sort of Mormon mafia that was happening out in the western states during the 1800s. And of course, that plays a huge role in Riders of the Purple Sage as it's going up against the Mormon Mafia again. A lot of interesting stuff about the Mormons in Utah, I've noticed in a lot of literature. I'm not sure if they were as bloody and murderous as they're portrayed. Probably not. But I know John Krakauer, I think is how you pronounce it, wrote a book about that I haven't read. It's a nonfiction book called Under the Banner of Heaven, and this satisfied the requirement to read something with green in the title. This book was wholly stupid. Now, actually, it was just a children's book. The thing is you were supposed to read a book while wearing a hat throughout the whole thing. I rarely wear hats, so I just popped on a hat, pulled up thin book off of the children's section, and read through it. Having that been said, this is, you know, for what it is, it's an interesting children's book. It's told with, pictures that are, the illustrator does silhouettes. That's pretty fascinating. And of course, it helped me satisfy my challenge to read 7 books in the next 7 days. And I actually am going to go on to explain some of the ways you can do that. As I mentioned before, a lot of books, older books, the authors seem to have tried to get a lot of content with a very small amount of pages. As I said before, reading the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, his actual stories are not that long. Now, a lot of these books contain forewords talking about the impact of his writing, and they have annotations and epilogues talking about the cultural relevance of Sherlock Holmes and everything like that. But all his works, the 4 books plus all the short stories, can fit into like a book that's, albeit formatted with very fine print, to be like 300 pages. So one of the things I wanted to get to is great reads that you can read that are part of sort of great American literature, just great world literature, I should say, that can be read in one sitting or at least one day. Also, to keep in mind when you're doing this, what you can do is you can take one of the longer books and just chomp at it a little bit over the 7 days. So, you see I've started out here with all the 4 books that are canon Sherlock Holmes. That's A Study in Scarlet, Sign of the Four, Hound of the Baskervilles, and Valley of Fear. As I mentioned, all of those can be read in just a couple hours, really quick. Another one is Peter and Wendy. That's by J.M. Barrie. That's essentially the book that started and developed the whole Peter Pan mythos. Warning, it has a lot of dark content in it for what you would think for what is actually a children's book. Next, I mentioned Fahrenheit 451 and Halloween Tree by Ray Bradbury. Fahrenheit 451, of course, well-known American book. Halloween Tree, not as well known, but still very good. Definitely a children's book, but some mature content. It talks about the history and development of Halloween. Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad is a story about the ivory trade that Britain had in Africa and essentially going up the river to get this crazy governor. This inspired Apocalypse Now. Red Badge of Courage was a great but small novella about the Civil War. The Great Gatsby, pretty much everybody probably knows what that is. That's a sort of roaring 20s boom novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald, and actually contains a fair more amount of humor than you're used to seeing probably in some American lit. Werewolf of Grosse Pointe and Other Stories by Gundella. I actually have a very creepy story about this here book. Here again, it's a local folklore book. So Gundella, that's not a real name, that's a spiritual name, was a practicing witch in Michigan. And when I read the book, there was a thing to forward her stories of supernatural encounters. And her address was Garden City. Now, I grew up much of my life in Westland, Michigan. And I went to Garden City schools in the Garden City School District. So that sort of piqued my curiosity. What else piqued my curiosity is when I was going to high school, that is Garden City High School, an occult shop opened up. And so I decided to do some research, and I was reading this on Halloween because, Halloween to me is my second favorite holiday. There's Easter, then there's Halloween. And I decided to see if there was any connection between her and the store, and there is. Her daughter opened up the sort of occult shop, but was murdered by her own husband shortly thereafter. So kind of spine tingling and everything like that on how and oddly enough, she was murdered on Halloween. So yeah, all kinds of really creepy stuff with that. Hiroshima by Hearsay or Hersey, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. Essentially just what happened on the day of the bombing at Hiroshima. And it also then goes on to explain sort of how those people were looked after, their health care concerns and stuff like that. The Outsiders, and that was then This Is Now by S.E. Hinton. The Outsiders is a great book. It really is. It's credited with creating the modern YA genre. I don't know if that's necessarily true. Well, I don't agree with that, but that's what it's credited for. The Outsiders is a great book. That was then This Is Now is kind of a sequel, maybe more so a spiritual sequel. I would say you should read The Outsiders before you read That Was Then This Is Now. S.E. Hinton truly does a good job of getting masculinity right. Call of the Wild by Jack London, that's an American classic, and could breeze through in your morning commute. The Perfect Storm by Younger is probably the longest one on this list, and you could debate whether it's one you could read in one sitting or a day, but it's written in such that it's paced fairly well. I will say this, give this book a try. Of course, I'm a big nonfiction guy, and you can see it here. The Boys from Brazil, that's another one that might be a little bit long to be considered a one-day or one-sitting read. The Boys from Brazil is sci-fi, and it gets into what if there was a bizarre plot to essentially create the Aryan race using genetics essentially out of South America. Flint, a very good Western by Louis L'Amour. Animal Farm by George Orwell, that's an American classic. Armed and Dangerous by William Queen. So William Queen was a career ATF agent. And he's actually wrote at least two books that I know of. One is Under and Alone, which is a much more comprehensive book about him infiltrating the Mongols. Armed and Dangerous is about him going up into the hills to capture this guy who's an extortionist, careerist criminal. He's a bit on the crazy side. He shoots houses up. He blows stuff up. The thing was, though, is that he would just literally keep his hideout or his home up in the California hills. So they had to go in and get him there. The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. This was a very quick read by Marielle Spark, and it's about it's set in 1930s England, and it's about a teacher that's Jean Brodie, who is a sex-positive feminist. And initially the book starts with how she sort of clashes with the current administration. It gets into the relationship of her Brodie set. These are students she identifies with a lot of potential, and she wants to essentially she tries to make them, I don't know if you'd call it brainwashing, but she definitely wants them to be loyal to her, and she teaches them to kind of be a little bit vampy. I like this. It's kind of refreshing, especially in an era where we're supposed to deny that there's differences between men and women. Sort of read this book, which is all about, a professor who teaches people that no, there is a difference, and women should maximize what you would call sexual capital. Of course, the book does get into some very serious themes, though. Jean Brodie does some fairly underhanded stuff with these young women. It leaves you with a lot of moral questions. The Pearl by Steinbeck. If you're looking to punch your Steinbeck card and you don't have a lot of time, The Pearl is probably his shortest work and very easy to get through. It's less than 90 pages, and those are a small 90 if I remember. Steinbeck was inspired to write this. It's him writing and expounding on a urban myth or fairy tale in the Sea of Cortez. Then there's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Very well written. Deals with the theme of the shadow self. Lots of Jungian psychologists are going to love that one. The Art of War. Sun Tzu, a manual which has endured maybe the most important test of all, the test of time. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, that is a short story. But a lot of people haven't read it. A lot of people know the legend, they've seen the movie, they've watched the cartoons, but they haven't read the actual short story itself. Here again, if you can find it in book format, that's something you can go through, and you've taken in part of what is considered great American literature. Night by Weissel, or I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it, but either way, a memoir of him at a concentration camp. Really well written, super vivid descriptions, but yet very, very precise. It's a quick read. And last, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. Dorian Gray drinks, he screws. I don't get why people consider him a villain. I would bro down with this guy. Really good book, well written. It's a supernatural horror book. People consider it a philosophical thing, but there's a lot of elements of supernatural horror in this book. So that would be, these are my recommendations for if you want to get into good literature, but you, like a lot of people, just don't have a lot of time.